All right, so we are diving into a really complicated topic today.
Yeah.
The abortion debate.
Definitely a charged one.
Um, you've given me so many different sources on this.
I tried to give you a variety.
Yeah, like legal stuff,
Yeah.
ethical things, societal perspectives.
It's a big one.
It's a lot. And
Mm.
honestly, like, even just preparing for this deep dive has been kind of eye-opening for me.
I bet.
But that's what we do here.
Right?
We unpack these big, complicated topics, and today we are going to be talking about the pro-life side and the pro-choice side.
Brett, the main arguments.
Yeah, but like you said,
It's more than just surface level.
you guys listening already know the basics, like, the main arguments on each side, so we're going to go a little bit deeper.
Deeper into the nuances and the gray area.
The real-world impacts.
Exactly. One thing that really stuck out to me when I was reading through all the stuff you sent me is that this is a global conversation.
It's not just here.
This is everywhere.
Wow.
Countries around the world are dealing with these same questions.
Right.
And so you see like all these different answers in their laws and in their social norms.
So it's almost like every country is running their own experiment on this.
Exactly.
Trying to find that balance between individual rights and, like, their values as a society.
For sure.
So before we get into, like, the specifics of all the different arguments,
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful to just kind of set the stage a little bit.
Okay.
What are the fundamental starting points for each side?
Yeah, so like generally speaking, pro-life advocates tend to start with the idea that life begins at conception.
Okay.
And so from that point, they argue that abortion is morally wrong.
It's like morally equivalent to taking a human life.
Exactly. And a lot of times this stance is rooted in religious or moral beliefs,
Right.
and it emphasizes the inherent value of like a human life.
Like from the very beginning.
Yes.
Interesting.
And then on the pro-choice side,
Yeah,
it's really all about a woman's right to bodily autonomy.
that's a big one.
Yeah. It's the right to make decisions about her own body,
Her own body.
which includes whether or not to continue a pregnancy.
And one of the articles that you sent me had, like, this really powerful analogy about bodily autonomy.
Oh, yeah.
It said, imagine being forced to donate a kidney to save someone's life.
Wow.
Even if it's a noble act, like most people, they just instinctively recoil at that idea.
It's like being forced to use your body in a way that you don't want to.
Yeah, and that's really the core of the pro-choice argument.
It is.
That forcing a woman to carry a pregnancy against her will.
That's a violation of her fundamental rights.
It's interesting, too, because this argument, it goes beyond the individual.
Yes, it does.
It extends to, like, broader social and economic implications.
Definitely.
Yeah, and there was this one economic argument that I thought was super interesting.
Tell me.
There was a study that linked access to safe and legal abortion with an increase in female labor force participation
Really?
and earning potential.
Wow.
So it basically argues that restricting abortion,
Can have a huge ripple effect
yeah, it limits women's opportunities.
across society as a whole.
So we've got ethical arguments, legal arguments,
all.
all these threads.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the pro-life side. We talked about the sanctity of life.
Right.
What are some of the other key points that they raise?
Well, some pro-life advocates will also talk about the psychological impact of abortion.
On women?
Yes.
Okay.
Some argue that it can lead to long-term guilt, regret, even PTSD.
Yeah, there was a study, actually,
Really?
that found a correlation between abortion and an increased risk of depression.
That's interesting.
But it is important to note that the people who did that study, they emphasized that more research needs to be done.
Yeah. Correlation versus causation.
Right.
We don't know exactly what causes what.
Exactly.
And there may be other contributing factors.
So it's like a piece of the puzzle,
Right.
but not the whole picture.
Right.
And then on the other side of that, you have pro-choice advocates who say that, forcing a woman to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term.
That can also have psychological consequences.
Yeah, they often point to studies that show increased rates of anxiety, stress, even domestic violence.
In situations where women are denied access to abortion.
Yeah. So it's really like this huge ethical knot
Yes.
where every argument has a counter-argument.
Exactly.
And it's so hard to find, like, definitive answers.
It really is.
So I think that's a good point to kind of move into the real-world examples.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to talk about these arguments in theory,
Right.
but when you see how they play out in the real world,
It gets even more complicated.
it's even more complicated.
Yeah.
And you gave me some sources from the U.S., Ireland, Poland, and India.
A good mix.
Yeah, and each one tells a completely different story
Absolutely.
about how societies are navigating this issue.
Yeah.
So let's start with the U.S.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of people would agree that the overturning of Roe v. Wade
That was huge.
is a landmark event
Definitely.
that completely reshaped the legal landscape.
The legal landscape around abortion in this country.
Yeah, but from the research that you gave me, it seems like it wasn't just about Roe.
Yeah.
Like there was a bigger legal strategy at play here.
Right. There had been a long-term effort from anti-abortion groups.
For years.
Yeah, they'd been chipping away at Roe v. Wade
Oh.
in a lot of different ways.
Like,
Passing really restrictive state laws,
okay.
challenging legal precedents,
And I think a big part of this was,
appointing conservative judges to the Supreme Court,
yeah, and all of that led up to the Dobbs decision.
which overturned Roe v. Wade.
And now basically the question of abortion rights is back in the hands of individual states.
Yeah.
So one of the articles you sent me called it a patchwork of abortion laws.
Which is a great way to put it.
Yeah, because it varies wildly from state to state.
Totally.
In some states, abortion is essentially banned,
Ban.
and in others, it's relatively accessible.
Right.
And we are literally seeing women crossing state lines.
To get the care they need.
It's almost like we've gone back in time.
To a time before Roe v. Wade.
So that brings us to the legal complexities surrounding all of this.
For sure.
And one of the sources that you sent me really delved into the philosophical and ethical arguments about when life begins.
That's a big one.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
And it seems like everyone has a different answer.
It does feel that way.
Conception, heartbeat, viability outside the womb.
And each definition has huge legal and moral implications.
Yeah. So, and then you also have the religious beliefs that are tied into all of this,
Of course.
which further complicates the debate.
Yeah. For example, the Catholic Church, they believe that life begins at conception.
Right.
So they are very firmly opposed to abortion.
But there are other religious traditions
Right.
that have more nuanced perspectives.
Yes.
And they may acknowledge situations where abortion might be morally permissible.
Right. So it's important to remember that even within seemingly unified groups, like a religious group,
There's a spectrum of beliefs.
a huge spectrum,
So we can't make generalizations about entire groups of people.
it's just not accurate.
And speaking of all these different perspectives,
Yeah.
you also sent me some sources about countries where public opinion has shifted
In a big way.
on this issue.
Like Ireland.
Ireland.
Yeah.
Ireland is really interesting because for decades, abortion was completely illegal there.
Yeah.
And that was largely due to the influence of the Catholic Church.
Right.
But then in 2018, they had this nationwide referendum.
They did.
And it resulted in the legalization of abortion under certain conditions.
So that's a pretty major change.
What I thought was fascinating about that is that it wasn't just about changing the law.
No, it's about changing people's minds.
It was about changing hearts and minds.
Yeah, the pro-choice movement in Ireland, they ran this really powerful campaign.
I read about that.
They focused on personal stories and compassion and the need for women to have control over their own bodies.
And that really resonated with people.
Clearly it did.
So that's a really good example of how societal values
Can change.
can actually change.
Yeah.
And then legal frameworks can follow.
Right.
But then you have a country like Poland,
Oh, yeah.
and it's a completely different story.
They have some of the strictest abortion laws in all of Europe.
Really?
Yeah, abortion is only allowed in cases of rape, incest, or if the mother's life is in danger.
And even then,
It's not easy to get access.
it can be really difficult.
Yeah, and that's led to a lot of protests and legal challenges.
I can imagine.
Women are having to travel to other countries to get abortions.
Wow.
It's a clear example of how just limiting access doesn't actually eliminate the need.
It just creates more problems.
Exactly. It makes it more challenging. It makes it more risky.
And it makes you wonder, what is the role of the government in all of this?
Right.
Like, how far should the state go in regulating reproductive health care?
It's a big question
A huge question.
with no easy answers.
And it's not just about legal access either.
right.
It's about practical access. It's like, can people actually get the care they need?
Even if it's legal.
You brought up India
Yeah.
as a really good example of this.
Abortion is technically legal in India,
Okay.
but it can be very difficult to actually get an abortion, especially for women in rural areas.
Why is that?
There are a lot of reasons.
Like what?
A lack of trained providers. There's social stigma. There are economic barriers.
So even though it's legal,
That's not accessible,
so it's like having a right on paper.
but not in practice.
And that brings us back to the issues of healthcare access,
Equity.
social justice,
It's all connected.
because restricting abortion often disproportionately impacts marginalized communities.
It does.
The people who are already facing barriers to healthcare, education,
Yeah.
economic opportunities.
So these laws are just making existing inequalities even worse.
Right.
It's a really complex issue.
Yeah, after going through all of this research,
All this information.
I'm just struck by how complicated it is.
It is.
This isn't just like two sides yelling at each other.
No,
This is a whole bunch of different perspectives and ethical dilemmas.
legal nuances.
Real-world consequences.
And the consequences are so important to keep in mind
Yeah.
because this is about real people's lives.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
A lot of ground.
So for the people listening out there,
Yeah.
I think the key takeaway is that there are no easy answers here.
No simple solution.
This is a conversation that requires empathy
Critical thinking.
and a willingness to engage with perspectives that might make you uncomfortable.
Perspectives that challenge your own beliefs.
Yeah.
That's how we grow.
And as we've seen from the global examples that we talked about,
Right.
this is happening everywhere
All around the world.
in different ways,
Different approaches.
in different outcomes.
In different consequences.
So for you guys listening, as you continue to explore this issue, I want you to think about this.
What approach do you think best balances
The rights of the individual,
with the values of society?
because that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And there's no right or wrong answer.
It's something for each of us to think about.
As individual,
And as members of a larger community.
so that's something to keep in mind
Definitely.
as you navigate this complex landscape.
This is a journey
It's a journey,
with no easy answers.
but it's important to keep asking these questions
Absolutely.
and keep learning
And keep listening.
and keep having these conversations.
That's what it's all about.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.